Welcome back to The Tea with me, Myriam Francois. Today, we're diving into the results of the US elections. But rather than focusing on who won, we're here to unpick the spectacle of the elections themselves, what the elaborate show truly hides, and how the outcome affects lives beyond US borders.
And I said, let Trumpomania make America great again.
Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans?
Do you have plans to visit the border?
I believe in Jesus, guns, and babies.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the greatest capitalist in the history.
America. We have 1,000 trillionaires in America. I mean, billionaires in America.
The greatest democracy on earth. Now, joining me for this deep dive is none other than George the Poet, award-winning spoken word artist, poet, rapper, author of Track Record, Me, Music, and the War on Blackness, and host of a critically acclaimed podcast on the BBC. George, welcome. So good to have you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Myriam.
Okay, first initial reactions. We now know Trump has won the election. What are your thoughts?
It's bittersweet, right? I'm relieved that the Democrats weren't rewarded for their obvious role in the genocide. I'm not optimistic about what Trump's return will bring for for minorities in America. He seems a bit more hawkish than before. I'm obviously not optimistic about what it would mean for the Levant, for Palestine in particular. But yeah, we needed a clear message about how this genocide has impacted real people. You know, I was just making the point earlier that a lot of people thought Kamala was going to win. I never thought for a second she was, mainly because the Democrats and Kamala in particular were overtly disrespecting and disregarding their base, and Trump just wasn't.
Well, this is the wildest thing, right? So yesterday, on the night of the elections, I called up a few friends in Washington and I was like, look, what's the prediction?
Right.
Where's this going to go? And everyone was like, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. All right was the word being used. It's going to be all right. It's going to be Kamala, all right? And I just thought that was so interesting. It reminded me of Brexit here in the UK, because I was covering it at the time as a reporter, and we all went to bed with, it'll be fine. People will be reasonable.
Yeah.
Of course, we woke up to, what has since proven to be the disaster we all assumed it would be. But I'm particularly interested in this idea that Trump has always been perceived as an outsider, as the outlier, the underdog.
Can you imagine? Poor Trump.
Right? This poor millionaire, corrupt, sexual harasser, all the, everything we know of this man. And yet in the Washington circle, this man is seen as the underdog. And I just wanted to talk to you about what does that actually tell us about the US political system if somebody like Trump, who is clearly an extremely powerful man, an extremely wealthy man, an elite, there's no other way to term it, in the same way that people like Farage here in the UK try and present themselves as being one of the people. But if he is perceived as that, is it just PR, or is it actually telling us something about the fact that relative to the old money and the sort of more quiet power of behind the scenes power in Washington, that actually he is an underdog?
I was recently watching stand-up comedian Shane Gillis. I find him very funny. And he was talking about the first time Trump was entered into the presidential race of 2016 and how everyone was unprepared for what he was going to bring to the debates. I think even in the primaries, everyone was unprepared because, in Shane's words, they just had a line of nerds just coming up. I believe in Christianity. I believe in the family. I believe in conservative values. And Trump was just a renegade. You know how he communicates. It was very entertaining to watch. It was a wild card. It was just not something that the traditional politician could easily maneuver around in an era where people are sick of politicians. Public office doesn't hold the reverence it once held. So for Trump to come over and talk casually, his language was often coarse. He was often straight disrespectful to people's faces. It felt like a breath of fresh air. Now, going back to what you said that your friends in Washington were saying and how it reminded you of Brexit, all of this reminded me of 2016, but more on the American end. Brexit as well. I feel like 2016 was a big turning point for our whole generation. Brexit and then Trump winning was like, okay, you need to wake up, because what you're hearing in your circles is not necessarily what, the direction of the political culture in the place that you have been born and raised in. I was born and raised in Britain. I didn't see Brexit coming. The political and media class didn't see it coming. And likewise with Trump. So he looks like an outsider because he is a break from the style of previous politicians. But like you said, anyone that understands the true economic makeup of power of America, of the West, knows that he is cut from the same cloth as the old money. It's funny that you mentioned old money. I don't really know I don't know the ins and outs of his money and his family, but he just strikes me as a blue blood kind of guy.
For sure. I suppose I tend to think of power and real power as something that dissimulates itself, that is actually quite hard to identify. You have to really dig to find out who are the people sort of funding major campaigns, the people behind kind of Lockheed Martin, the people behind BlackRock,
think tanks.
Behind major think tanks. A lot of this is hidden. So I tend to think of real power as something that hides itself, and loud power and sort of celebrity power as part of what I call the spectacle, the charade. So what we are usually allowed to discuss on TV is what I call the spectacle. And this is kind of what I wanted to unpick today. We're allowed to discuss the show, which is what the intro was all about. But we're never really allowed to tackle the kind of more systemic forms of power that operate and which provide the continuity between administrations, and which actually even certain presidents have referred to as being sort of containers of things that they wanted to try and do differently, but which they realized once they were in office that there's limits to even what the president can do. So who's limiting what the president can do?
Right.
Now, of course, there's systems that limit what the president can do. We don't have to pretend there's just like nefarious forces. The nefarious forces can literally be the ways that systems are set up, the ways that things have to get approved, and the people that are the continuity people within those institutions. But I do find it interesting what it is that we are allowed to talk about during elections and what we are not. And we'll get into that in just a second. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you about this post that you put out on social media just a few days ago, which was really a call to African Americans to sort of consider their international solidarity obligations in their voting decisions. Should we take a look?
Black America, I hope you can see. Of all the things a colonizer won't do for free, they'll never treat you like a whole human being if you seriously think you can vote for your freedom. Even if the candidate looks like you, they've been given an agenda to push right through. I'm saying, Black America, let's get back to solidarity. However you vote is down to you though. We just pray you do so with moral clarity.
Moral clarity there, George, is what you were calling on American, particularly African-American voters to consider. And you were talking about Black internationalism. And I wanted to ask you about that plea, because I think for a lot of minority voters in this election, including Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, that there were considerations beyond those of the borders, right? So I wanted to ask you first about what does Black internationalism mean to you, and why was it important for you to kind of call on people to consider that in this election?
Thanks for the question, man. So Black internationalism speaks to the struggle against global imperialism, and that struggle occurring within us on a ground level as individuals, recognizing our role in a collective Pan-African cohort that has been tasked with resisting the onslaught of imperialism for those of us out here in the diaspora from within the imperial core, but worldwide it is really about seeing our interests beyond, just like you said, beyond borders, beyond our local context.
And that's where the real tension comes in, right? Because so much of the time we are, whether it's in America or here in the UK, or we could look at a number of different countries, encouraged, even as minoritized voters, to always just consider our domestic context and our interests within the core of empire, which is, I mean, we're no longer really the core of empire here, let's face it. I regularly refer to us here as the lapdog of empire would be more relevant these days. But in that sense, there is often a sense of a tension between the two kind of pools of what we need to be considering. Now, there was one critique of your post by an African-American fan with a username @Earth_tethered. I have to say he is a fan, because even though he said this, he kind of said very clearly he does love your work. And he said, yes, I agree that the current US administration is not doing what I want it to do in this regard. But this election is bigger than Gaza. There are also dead Black American children on my streets, killed by a system that devalues their lives in so many social, political, and physical ways. It is barely possible to breathe thinking about. George, what do you say to that? And of course, this is exactly the tension that we're referring to.
Yeah, and we have no choice but to deal with this tension. I felt a little bit awkward making this post. I actually said in the full version, look, you know, I try not to speak on anything out of turn, but sometimes airing it out is how we learn. So we got to deal with this tension. And I don't feel like that person is wrong. I don't feel like they're wrong in saying that this election is bigger than one thing and that we have a real crisis in Black America on our streets that we need to deal with. What I would question is the idea that the existing two-party system, of which the Democratic Party is a willing participant, I would question the idea that that is a route to combating what Black Americans are facing, the injustices that they're facing. That's a fallacy. When I responded to this person, again, I evoked Malcolm, because although Malcolm wasn't the only person to articulate the case for Black internationalism, he did so very clearly and very consistently, especially towards the end of his life. And he explained that the liberals and the Democrats are like the fox that bites you with a smile, whereas the Republicans are the wolf that will bare their teeth in a growl, in a threatening manner. But it's the same function, you know. When my fan here, thank you very much, Earth Tethered, spoke to the Black bodies and the kids that are being violated by the system, the Democrats are part of that system. So what I am speaking to is a pivot away from a system that is committed to upholding the injustices against you towards a new politic which looks at the hundreds of millions, the billions of us around the world that recognize our common problem in this imperialist domination.
We know that Arab Americans, despite representing only 1% of registered voters in America, took a clear stance in these elections, at least in places like Michigan, which, you know, went red, as they say, particularly after Trump's visit, where he was endorsed by leading figures of the Muslim community. Now, of course, we know that a lot of this was about punishing the Democrats for their ongoing support, material support, and otherwise for the genocide in Gaza. But I do want us to roll back a little and talk about what a vote for Trump in this circumstance means for Muslim Americans, for Arab Americans, for minoritized Americans who care about issues transnationally. Particularly if you think about the 2020 Trump so-called peace plan, which was, of course, developed by Jared Kushner, who, of course, is an expert on the Middle East, and decided to put together a so-called peace plan with no consultation of any Palestinians. And that plan, I think it's really important to return to today, now that Trump has returned to power, because it's quite significant in terms of what it proposes. We've just seen, after a year of this genocide, over a year of the genocide, a big movement of people calling for the liberation of Palestine, which clearly means the liberation of Palestine, means a Palestinian state. the proposal that Trump put forward in 2020 was one in which we were speaking of he was talking about demilitarized Palestinian enclaves. The best way to think about them, from what I can read of the plan, is essentially like American Native Indian reservations. That's what we're talking about. Completely demilitarized, completely economically dependent on Israel, a massively expanded Israel. No capital for the Palestinian enclaves in East Jerusalem, which is a red line for not just Palestinians, but many Muslims and Arabs around the world. So I'm just wondering how we've ended up potentially jumping from, what's the expression, the frying pan into the fire?
Right, yeah. I think one key thing to understand about American politics, Western politics in general, is it relies on manipulation and forgetfulness, willful institutional forgetfulness. So we have, at this point, decades of history of unfruitful and disgustingly biased so-called negotiations around the so-called Palestine question. And the precedent has always been that Israel just kind of gets everything it wants, and Palestine just gets, is offered a fraction of what is just if we, again, erase a huge chunk of history. If we just go from 1967 onwards. So that is it. We are required to not remember that. We are required to look at everything from whatever starting point is convenient for the imperialists. That leads to a situation where, people can not make the connection that you just made and not just say, this is exactly what was done to the Native Americans. This will lead to a situation in which they have no sovereignty. They are entirely dependent on their actual colonizers, and they are given an insulting, superficial kind of space to live their little lives and do their little things and have their little culture or whatever. So in terms of going from the frying pan into the fire, one of the most depressing things about this election has been that this was clearly the only way it was going to go. With the Democrats, we're going to continue to go from the frying pan into the fire. And with the Republicans, it's just on the cards. It's just that they say it and they don't pretend to say something else and then do what they're going to do anyway. So really and truly, without a mass turning point in consciousness where, and I think I said to you yesterday that this might be the beginning of it. They might be pushing too far. There are reasons why previous administrations didn't go this far in terms of outward, open ethnic cleansing, especially under conditions of social media where we can see it. There are reasons why governments once upon a time were scared to just out and out say what was going on. But these guys might be overplaying their hand, as the Democrats clearly did, to where there's going to be a turning point in the mainstream consciousness across a generation that say, in our lifetime, we have watched you murder hundreds of thousands. We have watched real children have to cry their eyes out after bombing, covered in rubble. We've watched people dig their loved ones out from under rubble that has been dropped by weapons manufactured in our countries, paid by our tax dollars. And now you are denying the children of all of those atrocities any sovereignty. If there is a real global movement, as there has been in the 60s and 70s, mobilizing against the Vietnam War, if there's a real movement to say, look, there is no more business as usual, nothing's going to run how you want it to, no one is secure, then yeah, we might see a reversal of some of this.
Let's hope that the power does indeed come back from people realizing that ultimately we are the majority. We do hold the power when we, as you say, raise our consciousness to the level that we realize that we do hold that power. I think my big concern is that we're seeing, I was listening to Marwan Bishara on Al Jazeera this morning talking about how this is the end of liberalism. This is the end of US liberalism. Now, you can look at that just in terms of values. You know, obviously, we're returning to kind of a more conservative sort of Christian identity in America, which, you know, some Americans clearly are in favor of. But we're also turning towards a more authoritarian system where there's more and more concentration of power in the executive, that actually Trump isn't just the president. He holds the House, he holds Congress. He has an inordinate amount of power. And for change to be able to happen, we need to be able to organize. We need to be able to not see a massive repression of people who stand outside the system. And I'm saying that in the context of, obviously, we've just seen an election which was, again, fought essentially between two parties, right? We've just had the same thing here in the UK. I mean, we just had recent elections here, although, you know, we were told we have a plethora of choices. You can choose Conservatives, you can choose Labour, you can choose Greens, you can choose Lib Dems, you can even go independent. Yeah, you can, but none of it really actually matters. And I've seen today all over Twitter people bashing people that voted Jill Stein, being like, oh, that was a lost vote. How do you feel about the state of democracy, you know, looking at the US, looking at this kind of charade of choice, charade of options that essentially narrow down to between kind of light blue and dark blue, and the fact that that's sort of replicated everywhere now where I'm looking at democracy, certainly in the Western world?
Yeah, you use the right word, charade. It is a facade of choice. It's like a simulation of choice, where, as Noam Chomsky said, you're free to debate fiercely within a very narrow spectrum of opinions, which are deemed to be acceptable by the political establishment. In my poem, in the poem I just released, and the poem I released around the UK election, I deal a little bit with the two-party system and how ultimately the same players, the same institutional players, the same industrial players are set to win. Just a couple of days ago, we had the head of BlackRock, would I say bragging? Talking factually and frankly about how the outcome of this election makes no difference to BlackRock, which controls trillions in assets around the world. I think like 11 trillion, because capital has its plan,
right?
And moves in the direction that it sees fit. So, what this means for democracy, you know, you gave your assessment at the start of the question that you posed, which just sounded like the descent into fascism.
Right.
You talk about the concentration of power, when you talk about the role of, a handful of corporations in public life across the board, that is fascism. And a lot has been written about liberalism, capitalism as cousins or handmaidens or midwives to fascism. You know, they work together because ultimately people power is a problem to those who want to dominate and organize society along the generation of profit, the extraction of value out of the rest of us. Those kind of people don't like when you and I and the people of the world are aware and are in unison and are standing up and vocal and demonstrating against what they're trying to do and resisting. So it really is in their interest if we are only able to process our options through two political parties. Now you can see all of this infight, and this is part of what I've been dreading about the outcome. Like I said, I strongly felt Kamala was going to lose, and that brought me no joy, because what I predicted was that we're all going to start ripping chunks out of each other. You know, that's why I released my poem as close as possible to the actual election results, so that I couldn't be said to have taken, even though I don't regard that argument as legitimate, I didn't want no one coming to tell me that I took votes away from Kamala. But what we have is a manipulative system in which we can only adapt. We can, or we imagine we can only adapt to the options that are put in front of us. So we think to ourselves, I am so much more scared of a Trump presidency that I now need to think about what I can achieve within Kamala. So you get all these people saying that those on the left, those who are progressive, can organize better under Kamala, which might be true. There are people saying that the way the judicial system changes and the way our people get locked up, marginalized, racialized people get locked up and treated harsher. Women are treated harsher under an openly conservative, openly fascist system. All of this might be true, which is why we now need to start using our political imagination and trying to think beyond the parameters that have been set for us.
You mentioned the confluence of power there. I was really sort of reflecting on the fact that obviously the owner of X, formerly known as Twitter, Elon Musk, was a huge supporter throughout this campaign of President Trump. And I was thinking to myself how that platform, if you think about it, a platform that, were it to be in any form of traditional media, would be regulated to some extent by things like Ofcom and the rules of impartiality, which we know have many, many flaws, but at the very least subscribe to ideas like not taking a clear side to influence voters when you have a platform that reaches so many millions of people around the world. Today, X, which is such an influential platform, was clearly a platform advocating for the election of Trump. That's the equivalent of the BBC coming out in support of a candidate. Mm-hmm. That in itself feels to me like such a profound kind of strike at some of the basic building blocks of what we need for democracies to be free and fair. Right. We definitely don't need billionaires with huge platforms having the ability to influence public opinion, and for the people, those the rest of us, not to have an equivalent platform. Like you might say, well, we can use Twitter, but we're not Elon Musk. Mm-hmm. Like when I tweet, or I'm sure maybe when you tweet it is like when it's Elon Musk, but for a lot of us, right, we don't quite have the same standing or influence as these individuals. And so we talk a lot about the influence of kind of Russian interference in the elections. What about the interference of big money in these elections? What about the interference of like private individuals who have vested interests in the outcome of the elections, using their platforms to completely, sway the electorate? Well, that apparently is all okay now.
Yeah, I mean, which is why, again, I'm optimistic that we have a generation that doesn't believe in any of these traditional harbingers of what was supposed to be the upstanding image of a capitalist society. Like a lot of our young people they just don't listen. They don't take any of this seriously. They have a very cynical view of power for all of the reasons that you just described. And what would be great is if, with that cynicism, we are now able to say, all right, cool, it is about a move away from traditional media towards independent media. That's all I consume these days. I only check what the mainstream is saying, and now regard, all of this big tech, all of these platforms as part of the mainstream, obviously, right, as they have been for decades, arguably from their inception. I don't check for them. And a lot of our young people also don't, and the esteem of being rich isn't what it used to be. Being a billionaire isn't what it used to be. So we really need to, push for a broader understanding of our alternatives.
And on that subject of these alternatives, I look at the election discussions, kind of what we're allowed to debate. And I say allowed, and I mean allowed. We're allowed in the debate, in the election debates, whether it's here in the UK or similarly in the US, to actually discuss quite a narrow range of issues. There are many very significant issues to voters that don't even appear to be up for discussion. And I find that so interesting. So we are allowed to debate things domestically, like, the cost of living, immigration, wages, but certainly in terms of structural changes, the way that power is constructed, or even things like foreign policy, it's almost like we're we're thrown into this constructed arena with loads of flashy lights and celebrities dancing along, and we're allowed to discuss these little issues and have our divisions and our big divisions over these issues that have, you know, an impact, but a relatively limited impact actually on our lives. And we're never actually allowed to discuss the more systemic threats to our freedoms, to democratic systems. Those are not even on the table.
Yep.
How do we get them back on the table, George?
Yeah. I think what many people hope for is a solution to these things that can happen in a short time frame, which there isn't. I really advocate for people getting, first of all, an understanding of the scope of what we're up against. The basic arithmetic that I do around this is, even if, let's say tomorrow, every bad guy around the world, every bad institution just lost their ability to influence everyone, that would leave a vacuum in which new ideas would have to fill that space. And what we really have to be prepared for is a long game of, first of all, continuing to educate ourselves on the existing arguments, the existing models outside of what we currently see in terms of foreign policy, in terms of fiscal policy, spending, our economic models. We need to be working on that in the off season when it's not just election time, and we need to find, as you're doing, ways of reaching people directly with some of this alternative thought.
I think that's such an important point. We often have been lulled into thinking that our kind of responsibility as citizens is to turn up once every 4 years and like pop a ballot. And it's like, hold on, there are entire political systems functioning 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And you're just going to think you're going to turn up who are we handing the responsibility to handle this to?
Right.
Do we trust these people to manage it? Because I'm looking at it and I don't sense that the people who are governing us, whatever party, the choice between the two shades of blue that we are being offered, is ever actually tackling the systemic issues that are leading to increasing poverty, global inequality. I mean, the fact that things like healthcare weren't up for debate in this US election. Healthcare.
Right.
Healthcare in America, when most people don't have healthcare.
Right.
Gun control. I'm sorry, did we not just have one of the worst years for, attacks on schools, on American children, and you don't think gun control should be up for discussion?
Insane.
We've just witnessed a genocide in Gaza that has been fueled by AIPAC, which is basically, a body that works for a foreign government, extracting taxpayer money from Americans to send it to a foreign government so they can...
How is that relevant?
Bomb kids. Right.
How is any of that relevant?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's ridiculous.
Let's talk about whether trans people can use toilets, can we?
Let's argue about that.
Let's argue about
and
that.
Let's promise to never agree.
Right.
That keeps us busy.
Right. And this is what I mean. I feel sometimes that when I'm watching the news, and I you talked about only kind of watching some what we call like mainstream news now, sort of to dip into it, that I am watching what we are permitted to discuss. And I don't want to talk about that anymore. We are way past that. Yeah. We need an awakening of people, as you were talking about transnationally, who recognize that our shared interests are the 99% and that it is the 1% who continuously screw us in various forms and have us essentially fighting over crumbs at every election. Speaking of deep states, this was a question that definitely has been burning the internet, but which has not been asked in the election season, despite the fact that we've had clearly the biggest movement, pro-Palestine movement in America, and I think globally, but let's talk about America because it's US elections. Imagine with everything we've seen, right? These campus encampments, the huge protests, the calls for sanctions, that this wasn't even up for debate, whether we continue bipartisan support for Israel. Who decided that?
Right. So you mentioned AIPAC, and AIPAC I feel like is not only symptomatic of the problem of lobbying in Congress in general, but it's like been one of the most instrumental organizations advancing the Zionist agenda within America. And it's the one that everyone knows of, but it also represents a lot of other lesser known organizations.
Totally.
Right? So when you talk about deep state and you talk about the consensus, what we are allowed to discuss, a lot of this is decided before it reaches the public.
But this is it.
Before it touches the media. It is decided that, do you remember that moment in the presidential debate where Kamala and Trump were arguing about who loves Israel more?
Oh my God.
Like this, it's just not a conversation that happens on the streets.
I mean, I have that conversation all the time, right? Do you love Israel? No, I think I do, right? You love them more, right?
Right. And so now we have to construct our history in terms of all the things that we did to prove that we loved Israel. And it's wild. It's an open embarrassment. Who called it an embarrassment? Someone used that word and it's just stuck in my mind ever since. But it is an open indictment. I think it was actually Candace Owens, of where American society is at, but there's nothing that the American people can do about it because it was decided before it reached the public. So that limiting of debate, that limiting of political outlook is largely managed by money. You know, the money that goes into Congress. This is money that funds people's political campaigns and careers really before they're even known. You know, people are earmarked for, all right, one day I think this person could take the office of yada, yada, yada. So they are visited by all these lobbyists. They take all this money and then they are they are set on a course of when you get into that house, when you get in Congress, just remember who your friends are. Otherwise you're done.
Right. And we heard, of course, recently it was doing the rounds on social media that congressman who was talking about every congressman has their AIPAC handler, right? So a little AIPAC handler who comes and just double checks that whatever it is that you are planning to push forward today, that we approve it. I'm sorry, a body that represents a foreign government gets to decide what your elected officials can put forward and ensures that if it isn't in line with their interests, that it doesn't. No matter if it's in your interest, no matter that like millions of Americans can't feed their kids, that the public schools are in ruins, that people are literally dying in the street because they can't afford health. Don't worry about none of that.
Yeah.
The most important thing is that we somehow protect Israel. For who?
Yeah.
Who cares so much about Israel?
Which is why, going back to the person, my follower who commented on my post, I was talking about, this election is bigger than Gaza. I'll tell that to AIPAC. The Democrats that you wanted to vote for, that, you identify with progressive politics, they are also largely funded by AIPAC. Now what?
Indeed. You might have remembered, so Puerto Rico was referred to during the elections as a pile of garbage floating in the ocean. I mean, sometimes...
What's going on?
What is going on, George? What is going on? Particularly because surely, Puerto Ricans actually vote in US elections, right? I mean...
They are US citizens.
They are US citizens. So, I mean, that kind of takes us into the wider question of the sort of underlying white supremacy of the American political system, which, let's face it, is not only something that Trump represents. He kind of, I don't know what your thoughts are, but to me, he represents the crassest version, the most like out there, the maybe least polished and PR controlled version of it.
The underdog version of it.
The underdog version of it. The guys were like, okay, we know, but like, shh. So given the reality that now that perspective is fully emboldened, right? I think Trump coming back to power, we have to remember that the end of his last presidency did almost end in civil war, that we did literally have like Ku Klux Klan people marching in the streets openly. Do you think that we are just seeing the unmasked face of US white supremacy, as some people say, or are they unleashed in that they are emboldening a fringe? Because I feel like that's essentially what the Democrats have always said. They've been like, no, if you vote for Trump, you're unleashing the white supremacists. But I know also friends of mine who say, oh no, they're just always there. It's just the Democrats are pretty good at sort of keeping them hush and presenting a good face.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Maybe it's the same thing, you know? So unlike the Democratic Party, I'm not going to gaslight marginalized and racialized people and pretend that there is not an unleashing. What appears to be, you know, I'm not in America, let me not also talk out of turn, but what appears to be an unleashing and an emboldening of white supremacists during Trump's tenure. But I also feel like it's a good cop, bad cop strategy to achieve the same thing. The unmitigated march of capital, the decimation of public services and infrastructure, the ongoing, aggressions around the world, the militaristic standoffs with China, Iran, Russia, they all go for the same thing, but they just say, but, if you guys don't support us in all of this, we're going to unleash the wolves, or you're going to unleash the wolves, which is a deep manipulation, man.
Well, it's the position of fear, right, that we're kept in order to ensure that we're compliant with the orders that come from above. Oh, of course, we understand because we don't understand. What is it? I mean, I'm pretty sure that whatever Trump understands, I can understand. I'm just put it out there. I think whatever Jared Kushner's able to digest,
Maybe
I could digest.
Maybe you
so
could.
What is it that we're not allowed to hear because we're just too stupid to fully understand? I just think there's a lot of taking the public for idiots. Now, when I watch election campaigns today, I don't know if it's just I'm getting old out here, but the cynicism that I have with regards to what we are being fed as the parameters of the debate feels to me increasingly at odds. I guess maybe it's also the dissonance you were talking about between sort of mainstream media discussions, which continue to corral the discussion according to the rules of the game, and more discussions that are happening in independent spaces that maybe go beyond the bounds. And so the chasm between the two is making it even more obvious.
But that's why I got to commend you and everyone in your line of work in terms of the journalism and the daily commentary. I can't do daily. I got to, pick my moments and drop a poem. But what I see you doing, I just can't. It's so important because so many lies get put out and so much disinformation is routine. So much propaganda is routine in mainstream media that it does take for people like yourselves to constantly be checking these people to their face in front of everyone and saying, you are lying. You are instigating all the problems that you're complaining about, and you are pretending to be on the side of the people that look to you for a solution. I can't do that because, as you said, the more I watch, the older I get, the more I feel myself getting jaded, getting disillusioned, and, pushed towards depression, which is what they want. And then it occurs to me, all right, cool, they're trying to break you. They're trying to break everyone that understands, and they're trying to manipulate everyone that doesn't. We can't have that.
We definitely can't have that. And thank you for kind of coming on and helping kind of the conversation move forward on this, because I do think the more of us kind of get together, this is one of the things that social media doesn't allow us to do and sometimes lulls us into thinking we're doing when we're not. And that is coming together, getting organized, strategizing and taking action. I was watching a video recently about somebody saying, the worst form of activism is to think that you're doing something when you're not. And social media is kind of really good at lulling us into thinking that we're doing that. I've shared stories, I've posted something, but posting something is the probably favorite means of protest for governments because you didn't actually do anything. You just told people who probably already agree with you what you think, and now the government knows. Well done. Flagged yourself. But you haven't done anything concrete when it comes to changing things on the ground, which does require coming together, which does require action. And ultimately, let's face it, probably does require a level of risk. Because as these systems become more and more authoritarian, and I have to say, if there's one thing that I feel like I've been watching over the last few years and that the Trump administration does make me more and more concerned about, is the growing authoritarianism, the growing sense that actually, there's these figures in power believe that, you have to kind of abide by their rules. And if you don't, there's severe punishments. The spaces in which dissent can occur are disappearing. And we have seen it obviously in social media, right? You and I post on socials. We've seen people's accounts taken down for posting on Palestine. We've seen, people being censored on X, even on TikTok, on YouTube, on all these platforms that there's so much excitement about. But really, I have to say, I have a little level of skepticism when it comes to whether they can deliver any real change. They can help us connect, identify each other, and also always remember that they help others identify us pretty quickly as well, and create the lists. But they don't lead to action. As someone who kind of has studied the prior movements, you talked about Malcolm X, you talked about Black transnationalism. How do you see the sort of pillars of change that are necessary for people to be able to actually move this conversation forward so that we don't end up depressed, that we don't end up stuck? I mean, so if there were 3 things people have to do when they, finish this podcast in terms of taking action, so that they don't just sit there being depressed about the outcome of the election, what would it be?
The first I would say is study the people before us, because a lot was done. A lot has been done to resist fascism, to resist imperialism. And if you don't take note of that, then you think that you're starting from scratch, where really you're just disadvantaging yourself by not learning the lessons of the past. Study, by all means, meet up, congregate. And also, I have to find a way of saying this that isn't going to get your channel in trouble, yeah? But be open-minded. Be open-minded about what is incumbent on you to do, right? A lot of people, I've seen this in some of the resistance movements of this country, a lot of people can't think outside the box. They can't think outside of what they've been told that they're allowed to do.
It's scary.
Right. So beyond posting, some people can't even post because they're like, yeah, but I'll lose my job, end of conversation.
Right.
Or there's nothing I can do, end of conversation. You got to be able to think beyond that. And on that note, I do want to shout out Palestine Action for their recent, pressure that they've been putting on Barclays Bank to disinvest from Elbit Systems, which was announced last week. We all know that it was due to the agitation of Palestine Action. The pro-Palestine movement has been active in this country for decades. But again, as long as they're, boxed in to operate within certain accepted actions, what good has it done? What's the material outcome?
And they're paying a high price for it. A number of them are in prison right now, right? They were not given bail. So
there's a price to pay.
There's a price to pay. One last thing I wanted to talk to you about was celebrity endorsements. Like, we see them, especially in the US election. Right. And I guess I'm coming off a year of, I think, celebrities coming under a lot of scrutiny, particularly for often their silence around the genocide in Gaza.
And now all of a sudden they're political.
And now all of a sudden, but they're not. Beyonce speaking as a mother, George.
She's a mother.
She's speaking as a mother. She's not talking as Beyonce. I mean, I saw Beyonce, but apparently she was just there as like any regular mum. Yeah. So I want to ask you about celebrity endorsements and the politics of representation. We know that this is an instrumentalization of the politics of representation, right? It's like, oh, Black voters will be happy we got Beyonce. Young voters will be happy that, Kamala's brat. I mean, is it just me, or is it just cringe, or is it just, what's the situation?
Yeah, cringe is a good word, man. Cringe, for the rest of time, all of this footage of these celebrities coming out to cape for Kamala is going to be cringe. It will be cringe, but it's also insidious. You know, I laugh at it because it's cringe, but the minute I stop laughing, I'm like, oh, that's bad, man. Again, going back to the reliance of manipulation of the US political system, these celebrities are apolitical until it is time for them to come out and endorse the system. An endorsement for Kamala isn't an endorsement of any particular politics because, in my opinion, Kamala didn't represent any politics. It's an endorsement of the Democratic Party and its role within upholding the good cop. It's the good cop, bad cop, but it's the cops, isn't it? So it's been really insulting to watch the weaponization of identity politics, particularly on the basis of race and gender with regards to Kamala. It's been really cynical. The idea has been that these guys, Beyonce, for example, represent black, represent woman. And without having to say so, as a black woman, you're out of line. Or as someone who likes black and supports woman, you are out of line if you don't put your vote here. The implication is already there, right? So they get these symbols of diversity, symbols which do nothing materially to challenge the injustices, the structural injustice that are faced by women, that are faced by minorities, ethnic minorities, global majority people. These people do nothing to upset that system. So their outward appearance is used to co-opt, to trick, or to dismiss minorities with the outcome of appropriating their image for the system. Why do they do it?
Why do they do it? I have multiple theories on this one. So, like, power is a powerful drug, right? I mean, you and I both know people who have been on the up and have changed, right? Let's be honest, that not everyone stays the same on the journey up. The closer they get to power, the more appetizing it appears to provide lubricants for the maintenance of their proximity to that power. And particularly when you become a business, which is what Beyonce obviously now is. Beyonce and Jay-Z are almost an institution, I guess, these days. You know, I do wonder whether there are not also business interests behind the scenes that are related to the support that they offer. But I do have to say, for me, the most egregious thing was watching, whatever your views of Beyonce, the co-optation of Black Panther imagery, the Black Panther tradition, which I hugely personally admire as someone outside of it, obviously, but I hugely admire being co-opted and then used in service of an institutionalized party, which the Black Panthers would clearly be turning over in their graves if they saw. I mean, there are still some around today, but
there are some that are still in jail.
Right.
I literally held my stomach even though I've seen that image a million times. It's just this time just hit me differently. And I'm with you. It's still weird to me because it's a risk at the end of the day. Kamala's not in office. Again, very predictably from, my opinion, she's not in office and they've thrown their weight behind her. So I agree there are probably huge economic incentives. I just wonder if there are political ones too.
Yeah. I mean, look, we've also seen, it's not like Trump began his career in TV and then converted to politics. Who knows what people's other...
You're playing the long game.
Yeah, there are aspirations that may exist beyond that. But I personally, when I see someone like Taylor Swift, who has such a huge influence on young people, I mean, we're talking about she's the number one listened to artist in young girls, particularly in America. Her making a political statement like that, I almost feel like it's reckless.
Yeah, listen, man, we have a young family member, a girl, we just adorable little girl. She's 11 years old. And she came back from school talking about some Kamala. And I had to just burst her bubble a little bit.
Yeah.
And as soon as I did it, I felt a little bit, bad. But I was like, no, they're bad for even putting Kamila's name in her head. She don't even need to know about this right now. Because when the time comes, she's going to have to understand everything that Kamala stood for, everything that Kamala stood for, which is not a conversation I want to have with her right now. But to your point about Taylor Swift, like I said initially, it's insidious, it's manipulative.
Right. I think that's definitely been the theme of this election run-up. Well, look, I just want to say a huge thank you to you, George, for coming on the show today. And thank you all for watching. If you liked today's episode, click that like button now. And remember to follow us on Instagram and subscribe for more episodes that dig deep into the story behind the stories and keep questioning what lies beyond the headlines. Thanks for watching.